Next speaker is a Canada researcher in history and sociology of science. He's a professor of history and sociology at the Department of History at the University of Quebec in Montreal. Please join me in welcoming Professor Yves Gingras.
Thank you very much. So I'm glad, like all of you, to be in this interdisciplinary colloquium. I think that I start from the idea that if we are meeting a lot of philosophers starting a colloquium like that on understanding replication across the sciences, I think the context is obviously linked to this recent upsurge of discourse about the supposed replication crisis. It's always good in newspaper, even newspaper like Science and Nature, they are newspapers, to hype things as there's a crisis of this, because then people look at them. So now we take a distance from that and we try to say, yes, but we've been working as philosophers and historians and sociologists of science on the question of replication for decades. And now scientists have their own problem. They don't read much of sociology of science, not much of history of science. And they reinvent that, oh yes, replication is an important thing. So now they start to be reflexive about replication because they see a kind of crisis. And there is, in reaction to this so-called crisis, what I call a moral demand on replication. And we see, oh, there should be more replication. How is it that we don't replicate results? We should do it. And now they have a lot of people have grants to check among the best papers or the most important results of the past maybe 30, 50 years in different disciplines, as we will see, not only in social psychology, but in different disciplines, because it started out, in fact, much before the case of social psychology. It started out in biomedical research when private companies realized that half of the stuff they were trying to replicate in kind of secret because they wanted to develop a pill out of that to make some bucks. They realized that they were losing a lot of money to replicating the thing that didn't work. So they started to say, hey, come on, you scientists who bring us new knowledge, we want to transform them into profit, but in fact the knowledge you're supposed in the scientific papers, at least half of them is not really knowledge. It's an old problem. But now there is a moral demand of replication. So my approach is to think that the signal of this moral demand is in fact linked with the decline of trust. We just began to think about trust, and trust is the foundations of everything. It's the foundation of society, and science is a society. There's no private science, there's no Robinson Crusoe alone having knowledge, he has opinions. As we said in Hans' paper also, he said it's intersubjectivity. Objectivity is intersubjectivity, so it's a social construction of people with technology, with objects, but they have to agree on what is real and not, and this is based ultimately on trust. We trust that we have 2 or 3 examples of gravitational waves, because there's only 2 apparatus up to now, 3 are coming out, there's not a lot. We have only 1 CERN, not 2 CERN. We had SLAC, we had a lot of small particle accelerators, but now there's only one CERN. So we have to trust a lot of people around. Okay? So trust is basic. So I think that the reason why not we as historians or social, but scientists themselves say, hey, there is a crisis of reproduction. It's more a crisis of trust. But why then is a crisis of trust? I think the crisis of trust is strongly related to fundamental structural changes in the social structure and dynamics of scientific research since the 70s and 80s. That's my theory. So to come to that, I will have to recall some basic things, which I think is important. This will not be a micro-sociology of interaction between scientists debating about quarks or neutrinos, but about the background of the framework behind this, which makes possible for those scientists to discuss about, yes, is that a good measure? Should we reproduce this? That's what's going on in the lab. But what is going on in the lab presupposes a lot of social behavior that are taken for granted by scientists who, as Hans also said, have been trained to accept a certain number of things and takes them for granted. It's linked to what the macro sociologists will call the social structure of science. So I will just recall all the work that are links to that. We have first to remember the basic unit, which is the fact that what is a scientist doing? He's doing research. Then if he finds some results, whatever it is, call it a unit of knowledge. He found something equal in MC square or a new measure or something. He writes a paper. In the 17th and 18th century, as we saw, he would write books. But since the 19th century, that's finished. Discoveries are in papers. Einstein did not write a big book like Newton. He wrote small papers. So you have a paper. Then you have the famous peer review going on in the scientific journal. I won't develop that in detail, but I'll let you imagine that if the rejection cycle goes along 3 or 4 times, I let you decide what this guy or this woman will come. Dean, VP teaching, or president of the university, but it will not continue to do research and do science. Science is a cyclical system where if your paper is accepted, you get a publication, then you get recognition, which means in sociological terms, symbolic capital. But this recognition is a capital, which is transformed into economic capital to hire the students who will do the work, the postdoc who will do the work, and that the professor will sign happily at the end of the list of authors. And then this will turn around, and it has been essentially the way it works for centuries. But there is this famous normative structure of science that has been suggested in the 1940s by Robert K. Merton, that all this structure presupposes a certain normative aspect. Those normative structure, of course, like a good family, when things are going well, we see nothing. So to get at the implicit norms, we have to move them. We have to break them. And when we have a fraud, we realize that we have not learned in high school. Maybe now we will learn in the future, but nobody learned that you don't do fraud. You don't manipulate the data. Now with ethical boards, we learn only that. So there is those famous norms of universalism, which means that Einstein equals m square is not a Jewish science, despite that some believe it was a Jewish science. And it's not by chance that Merton wrote that in 39 and 41, in the realization that there was to be different kinds of science. Proletarian science in Soviet Union, Nazi science or Aryan science in Germany, and the bad Jewish science, or the capitalist science and the bourgeois science of the Americans. So he said that's bizarre, there are different kinds of science. So let's look at the historical record and try to reconstruct what is taken for granted in the scientific community. Because if it's a community, it means that there is a social norms and there is a social relationships. What is the building up of this relationship? Like in a family, you need some glue to tie those people together. For Merton, those glue were linked to universalism, communism, that very interestingly he called communism, but in the 50s his student changed that into communalism, because communalism is nice and neutral, communism is bad. In the 50s, a communist was losing his job in the United States, as you all know. And there is the famous organized skepticism, which is the collective test of, yes, you may have published this big thing, let's check if it's true. So the objectivity, again, is the intersubjectivity of people. So here it's taken for granted implicitly that you can reproduce it. That it's taken for granted that because you will try to reproduce it, so you take for granted it is reproducible. Because as we have all explained this morning, reproducibility is the implicit theoretical capability of being reproduced. That it is or not, it's an empirical and contingent matter. And there is this famous disinterest, we do science for knowledge. Of course, a lot of people will say, oh, but those are ideal things, which Merton knew. Of course, it's kind of horizon. Those are normative structure, means that you aim to do that. But he realized that also in the scientific system, you insist a lot on originality. That's the central token. But there is also this implicit norm about humility. That, okay, yes, I'm doing science, always glad I got this discovery, I may get the Nobel Prize, but that's not what I want. I really want to be doing science in my lab, and if the Nobel Prize comes, I'll be happy. But that's the behavior of the scientist. And what is interesting is that for Merton, he called that ambivalence. The ambivalence of the scientist is linked with the tension between two contradictory norms. And to show that this can be found a lot of time, I have a very nice example which is not very well known, about Einstein himself. Einstein himself, I do pure science, I write in my laboratory. But in 1907 or 09, I forgot if it's one or the other, we don't care about dates. In 1907, he got a letter from his good friend and collaborator, Max von Laue, who tells him, look, there is a paper by Johannes Stark in Annalen Physics, in which Stark talks about E equals m squared, and he says Planck's equation. He says, look, Albert, you should write to Stark saying that, I'm sorry, but it's not Planck's equation, it's Einstein's equation. I did this paper in 1905. So Einstein said, well, you're right. So he writes a letter to Johannes Stark. Dear Professor Stark, I just wanted to tell you that you say Planck's equation, but in fact I did this paper in 1905, and then the letter goes, he gets an answer from Stark, who says, oh yes, I'm sorry, I did a mistake, because I read this summary paper by Planck, and it was there, so I said that, but you're right, I made a mistake. In the meantime, before receiving Stark's letter, he wrote another letter. He said, Mr. Stark, I just wrote you a letter, but in fact it's stupid. I should not have written that. Who cares about the fact that I have a priority? We are all a community and we're working together for knowledge. Just these three letters incarnate exactly what Mertens called the ambivalence of the scientist. You play the game, but behind your back, you say, come on. And this is not a psychological thing. This is a social structural constraint. Because being part of the community is that if you don't accept what I say, it means that you don't want me as a member of the community. It's like in a family, if you invite, or you have a friend, you invite him to lunch, and he says, yes, we'll have lunch, we'll discuss. And after, say, 5 or 6 times of that, you realize that he or she never invites you back. You realize that there's no social bond, because the bond is linked to the gift and the counter-gift. So the social norm is the counter-gift. If there's no counter-gift, it means that I should stop talking to him, because in fact he is not a friend of mine, because there's no social bond. The social bond of the scientist is the recognition. And even the citation is part of the recognition before it been transformed in a stupid accounting unit. I will come to that in the 90s. It was part of the social bond, and you can read in the 18th century journals reviews saying that yes, this paper can be accepted, but the author should add a citation to this guy because he did this work before. It has to be recognized. It means that he is also part of our community and he has to be recognized. So the social function of citation, historically, is the giving of credit, of recognition as being part of the same community. So this basic structure is very strong and can be used to predict a lot of behavior. For example, the tension between originality and disinterest creates the tension about recognition, of course. And the tension between originality and universalism, which means that, as Einstein said, oh, it's all universal knowledge, creates the tension and creates priority disputes. Einstein was part of that because he wanted to defend his own discovery, though he agrees that it's a universal thing. And eponymy, like Einstein's equation, is another way to recognize the contribution. So this is a very simple, functional, structural model that helps us to understand the dynamics of science. And here is the transformation that has been happening in the 80s, because it will help us to understand why we're talking about the crisis today and not in the mid-19th century, in part for a reason that has been mentioned also by Jutta, that there are demographic aspects to science. Being in a very small community where you have a few physicists around the world who are friends is not the same thing as to being in a totally massified community since the 70s and 80s, where you have thousands of physicists all working on the same topic without knowing each other. So that was the first part I mentioned in the first slide. And again, this thing went around quite stable up to the 70s, I take it. And then a very small thing happened. And it's my idea that the unit of knowledge, your papers, scientific papers, any papers, was a unit of knowledge, very often small, but accepted as thus, was transformed in the 80s by what I call an accounting unit. The paper is no more is something to be counted. Okay, so if we count paper, it will have consequences. If it's an accounting unit, we can predict, and we have experimental proof that measured, it will just bring multiplication of papers. But if you multiply the papers around, you need multiplication of journals. And then there's something which is independent, because it's the meeting of two causal series that are not linked, but when they meet, they create a perfect storm, which is what we realize over the last 20 years, and that is peaking now. Is that, of course, with the internet, you totally change the nature of the scientific journal. Why? Because with our open access journal also, you lower a lot of the barrier to construct a new journal. If you're in the 60s or 70s, you want to create a new scientific journal, you have to find printers, you have to find a lot. It costs millions of dollars to create your journal. Now, with this, and this explains the fact that since 5 or 8 years, we're talking about predatory journals. Those are people who are bright, who said, okay, there are a lot of scientists here that says, hey, I want to publish my papers. Because they count them for my tenure. They say, okay, no problem, we'll publish your bullshit, but give you a few dollars here. And it's easy to create all these journals because it's just on the web. There's no paper copy. So you have an exponential growth of the number of predatory journals, most of them having the word international in the title. International journal of anything, of course, because they take also and they publish anything. Of course, if you have a multiplication of journals and a multiplication of papers, you get a crisis of evaluation. How can we evaluate all those postdocs that apply for the only job around? Then you will create the use of Santometrics. And you will use Santometrics to reward the people instead of using the unit of knowledge to reward the people. But the internet also plays a new act. It will create altmetrics. How many tweets have been said about your latest paper in Nature? No tweets, so probably it's not a good paper. And now that's my approach. That's the new system in which so that's the background. Now let's come to the change that we observe. That's the background behind. We don't see that. We live in it. Of course, we realized in the 90s a strong rise in retraction of papers. There are a lot of examples of that. Here's another, the number of papers retracted, the times it takes to retract, it's all going up. And here it's taken from Nature, rise of retractions. And so there's a lot of science, newspaper there's a lot of retraction around. Of course, one of the arguments, which I don't think is right, is to say, but we have more retraction simply because we better detect them. We know that in psychology, Ritalin for the youngs are going exponential, and they say it's because now we better diagnose our infants. I don't believe that, because the growth is so exponential that it's more that in schools, you don't want perturbating youngsters like I was. When I was young, they were tolerating me in the class. If I go back in time and they have Ritalin, they will give me Ritalin because they don't want to be perturbated. So that's not the explanation. The explanation is that there's something going on, which is linked, of course, and this has been predicted by Merton himself with his model, because if we go back to the model, the pressure to originality will give rise to two behavior, not 5. It's either you can answer this pressure of originality, you do more paper in Nature and less in, say, physical review maybe, or you cannot. And if you cannot, you get out, you stop doing the research, okay, it's too crazy, or you just fake the data. Or you publish rapidly the data and you say, oh, the data are good, but so not only are the retraction going up, but the corrigendum, the correction, which is less grave, but the corrigendum are going up because people publish more rapidly. And here it's very interesting. You may have known this because that's great. But again, it could be predicted. Don't need a... But we have to measure empirically the hypothesis. Okay? It makes sense that there should be a correlation between a kind of retraction index. Which paper are the most retracted? The one in low impact factor being a crude measure of the journal. Okay, if you have in some journal which are okay, but the more you go to the classic one that all the New York Times will talk every week, Nature, Science, Lancet, there tends to be a relation between retractation normalized by papers. You could see that in Nature, but all this converge that we have different indicators that goes up that suggest that there are more retractation, and I would look at corrigendum also, because that's less important, but it's important. The more if you have to correct your paper, it means that you have published it maybe too fast. And again, it's not only problem of reproducibility in the science we have taught, it's also true in computer science. Because now the rage is doing an algorithm that is doing so-called artificial intelligence. The problem is that the reason it's not reproducible is again linked to basic social reasons. Is that the codes in those algorithms are never given, because of course if you have a good algorithm you want to sell it, not to give it, because it's technology, it's not science, that's something else, but it's more technological. The test data that learn the algorithm are crucial. When they tell you that they have an algorithm that is able to recognize 95% of false of 98% of something, the fact that it can do that is based on the sample on which it learned. If it had learned the same algorithm, had learned on a different sample, its results would have been different. It's well known in computer science. Surprising, but it's obvious. And they don't give the code. So how can you reproduce this? Of course, there's no way to reproduce this. So now scientists started to say, well, if we want to advance as a science in computer science, we have to behave not as engineers or as technologists, but with private code, but we have to publish that. And this raises a question that is interesting about replication. How are we to treat in the community negative results? Negative results, of course, it's not a replication. It's the fact that we did something and there's no answer that we expected. And we all know here that very few most journals don't publish negative results. It's so true that now there's a new journal which publish negative results. There's a market for everything. So if you want some more money, just create a new open access journal. It may work for a year or two, but that would be enough to make some profit. Then you will close like most companies, but you would have done that for that time. So negative results are interesting and analogous to the reason of non-replication, because we have all agreed, I think, that even in the 18th or 19th century, and even more now, very few people replicate the data. And the reason is that in the social system, what will you win? No symbolic capital to reproduce the other guys. There's no reason to do that. So we should not expect that people will try to reproduce your work, because it will have a cost. It will need students, it will need computer, it will need money to conclude that, yes, you were right, thank you, but I will get the prize, not you. There's no second winner, so there's no reason to do that. And those who think that we should do more, I can predict that they can morally expect that in the future scientists should reproduce more or do more of the experiments before publishing them. They can ask that. But the probability that this becomes a reality is very low as long as the social structure, which is in fact even worse than that, will be in place, and it is in place. And the proof of that is the recent movement called slow science. You know, there is on the internet since 2010, the Slow Science Manifesto. So the fact that scientists themselves react back to the pressure is an indirect reason that the system is not the same as 1945 or 1905 with Albert Einstein at the Bern Patent Office. We're no more in that universe, though we still continue to give Nobel Prize, which is a totally anachronistic prize in the social structure of massified science. So our negative results is easier to publish than positive replication of results. It's not sure, because replication is not seen as very important, except as we will see for exceptional cases, which has always been the case. And the negative replication have even less reason to be published. Conclusion. The probability to try, not the reproducibility, but trying to bring scientists to do reproduction is very low, as we saw. If the result is trivial, and I give you a clue, if the result is trivial, that's the best approach to scientific fraud. You have 20 good papers just on the verge of being seen. Nobody will try to reproduce that because then they will find that it's invented. But nobody will produce that. There's no reason. And there's no reason because, as I said, it's based on trust. When trust won't be there, no paper will be published before reproduction because nobody will trust nobody. And of course, it's very high. If the result is very surprising, but then the fraud will become, the classic one, of course, is Henrik Schoen at Bell Lab. In what kind of world can this guy imagine that publishing paper in Nature, in Science, with a revolutionary approach to microchips would go without being seen? Just impossible. But here there is also the credibility of the institutions. Why did it take a couple of years to get him? I think it's related to the fact that this guy was not at Utah University or at some school, John Pope II school or something. It was at Bell Labs. So many scientists, well, you know, Bell Labs, they have the best lab, the best reagents, they have the best technology, the best vacuum. I can't reproduce this stuff because in my university, maybe my aluminum is not perfect, it's not pure enough. It can go along a few times, but then more and more scientists that, yes, you're right, but either can I. So at some point, someone will, and they found the jackpot that all this is totally invented. But there is no doubt this thing would become. The only thing we cannot predict is that is it 2 weeks, 3 years, or 10 years? It depends on the nature of the object. So the result of the constraints of the social structure, as I take it, that's my prediction, that at best scientists will invest their resource to reproduce big results. Because then it's so evident, and we saw it, for example, in the debate about the super luminous, of course they could not retry it because again there was only one experiment, but they forced them to check every cable, and then as Alan said, they found the cable is very problematic. Oh, that's it. Thank you very much.
We can open for a question. Jim, please.
I completely agree with the final conclusions you were drawing there, but there's one complication which needs to be added to it, and you didn't take into account the cost of reproduction.
Yes.
And there's a class of cases that are really important. So these are like clinical trials, say in medicine, which arguably cost $100 million to run or something like that. And there's plenty of reasons for being fraudulent. and the results could be spectacular. And so it would mean, on your criteria, that they would be found out very quickly. But the cost prohibits it, and they can get away for years, selling bogus drugs that are, extremely profitable and so on.
Yes, I thank you because I totally agree with that. It's one of the more constraints that's very important. I used to think about things like the Higgs boson because you have only one accelerator, but you're perfectly right. The cost of that, and it's not only the cost in that case, as you know very well, and everyone has a clue about it. Is that it's the cost, but it's also linked to the power structure of those people because the government could decide that you want to test that. So I've been proposing for many years that all clinical tests by companies, in fact, should be done independently. That the money that the companies put in those, just put in a white bank, where the government says, okay, if we have to test your company, we will do it because you paid the money in this bank, but the test will be done on the outside of it. So the cost is a big problem, but behind it there is the acceptance that we let Monsanto decide and take the real chemistry of the glyphosate, which is totally absurd because of the conflict of interest, which is built in. But I totally agree with you on this. I did mention it.
Chris?
So I really appreciated the sort of analysis of the social structure and how that's changed and how it leads to a crisis of evaluation. But I was curious whether there are any other, I guess, kind of like research ecosystems that might have a different social structure. So you mentioned biomedical research as something that you have thought about where there's a different set of incentives and structure, but I was also wondering about things like military research. Or are there other fields where the research structure is different, where we don't have the same kind of crisis?
That's a very good case. Of course, it's the thing I've taken for granted, and I'm glad that I used that question to make it explicit, is that I took for granted that since we're talking about reproduction, I was looking at what we call the scientific field. Okay, not the social field where patent, profit plays a role. We were talking about just pure, but even in the pure science, there's no result. But in fact, in the military, it's a great case because I use a case which is extraordinary. The military case showed that the reason science can get at some point to some truth is the intersubjectivity of the results. And here's the proof. Believe it or not, in France, in the 80s, I forgot exactly the date, but in the 80s, there was a scam of a guy who said, he went to the army, he said, I have a secret box here. And this box, you put it in an airplane, the airplane goes up the soil and it sniffs if there's petroleum behind. We will say it's crazy. Okay? But he said you cannot say that. So the French army says, and we have studied on that. So the French army said, oh yes, you have this detector. I said, yeah. So they bring the army, their army scientists, but it's thing in this closed universe of the army. Said, oh, that's interesting. He make tests and he says, you see, we discovered this. Until by chance, someone said, what is this? Well, that's not possible. So that's right. Let's take a scientist, a geologist from the university to come in. And of course, they found the scam. And you had the same thing in Iraq war. And you can read that example, by the way, in the book called The Pentagon's Brain. In Iraq, there was, again, a phony company who said we can detect metals with, and all the Americans said, but that doesn't work. But the Iraqi military continued to buy millions of dollars of this apparatus that was. So the conclusion is that, in fact, in this closed system, there's no intersubjectivity of the diversity of people who can say, well, you look at everything, but by the way, I'm come from Texas, and we don't use, So there are different dynamics, but here the dynamics is that it's universality. Means that we won't ask you if you're a man or woman. If you have an argument, put it on the market or not. So you're right, but those are exceptional cases. And now I think the army takes more cases that instead of being closed on. But it took many years, the French cases. It's not very well known, but there is a TV show on that.
Okay. So Derek, Bill, Alan, and then stuff. Oh, you do? Okay. So Bill?
I taught a decision theory course for many years, and one of those years, I had a brilliant undergraduate there who used freedom of information data that was available that he could find, and he showed that he was looking at the prospects of a company finding a cure for HIV, and he argued that it would be negative for any company that found it, because they could make so much more money on these things that minimize the effects as you go on, to have it go on. And this would be a reason for why we want to have not just companies funding medical research, because none of them would fund it, but you need to have governments or some other source.
Yeah, this is linked to chronic disease. Of course, there's more money to do with chronic disease than to solving the disease. You don't want people to be in health. You want to have chronic disease. This is why now everyone has to take statin, which is total nonsense. But now 80% of Americans, if you look at the numbers, have to take statin. Why? Because all your life you will take it. It will solve no problem. So you're right. They understood that it's better to keep you, and so they invest in chronic disease, not to solve the disease, because if they solve the disease, they stop selling the pill. But again, the dynamics of biomedical research is totally different, because it has a strong link with the market, which is not the case of what we call the scientific field, where we talk about elementary particle physics. Is there Higgs boson, or there quarks, or neutrinos? But I agree with your analysis.
So, let's start this and then Richard.
Just a question, isn't this desire for originality or for being first a more general social problem? For example, does anybody remember who were the second guys to climb Mount Everest? I once looked it up. I remember one named Schmid, but everybody remembers, Tenzing and Hillary. Tenzing may have been the first, the second pair to go. And then, or we make a big thing about winning the Triple Crown in horse racing, all three major races. It turns out nobody ever worried about, has any horse ever finished second in all three? It turns out there is one.
Yep.
Interestingly, it was lost to the same horse who won the Triple Crown. And for those of you who like Zeno's paradoxes, the margin of victory kept getting smaller. So if there had been a fourth race and you extrapolated, the horse that finished second might have won.
No, you're
But
perfect.
nobody remembers that.
Yeah, and you're perfectly. It means that, of course, behind this, some are specific for Merton to the science system, but some are universal. There's another one which is totally universal, which has been discovered by Merton, applied to science, but which is universal. Of course, it's the Matthew effect. And there's a book called The Matthew Effect. We look at the Matthew effect, which is the fact that the recognition, everything being equal, goes to the person already recognized. So he found that based on science, but there's a book who applies that and show that in all fields. And the example I always take to my students, I said, take the prime minister, he goes in a small place to take a hot dog. The guy will say, oh, it's on my arm. And then the beggar arrived, he wanted a hot dog, cannot pay, call the police. Okay? But the prime minister could pay its hot dog at $2, but said, no, it's on the house. Okay, because you're well known, you don't need to, you will always get, and in science, even though you have the last name in the paper, it will be called the name of we saw that in many Nobel Prizes. The postdoc said, hey, I did everything. We have, I don't invent that. Yeah, we have historical cases recently again. They post on the web that when he did this discovery, he was a postdoc. His professor was against the project, said that's crazy, but do it on the corner of the shelf here. But when it works, he got the Nobel Prize. So some social phenomena are universal in the sense that you will find them as well. Like, for example, the social bond. Marcel Mauss' notion of gift and counter-gift, it's the basic of any social community. And here, the gift is the paper, is the discovery. And the counter-gift is the publication and the recognition in the community. This is why, as I said, nobody will stay long in this system. Nobody. Because nobody can survive without recognition. Nobody. Some are recognized in the field of stamp collecting. That's a field. You say, this guy is great, he has this stamp that nobody has. Okay. In science, this guy is great because he has demonstrated this theorem that we don't care about if we are citizens. So this notion of community has universal characteristics that here applies to the subset of science. And it has consequences if we want to understand what will probably arrive in the future if we don't change that. For example, the role of women. What will happen if there's more women in science? If it's okay, if we look at that, we can expect that in all probability, very few things will be changed. Because very often they will have to behave like the dominant thing. So they will say, nuclear physics is real science, but a better biochemistry of eating, which is not in nature or science, it's less important science. But of course, it's more important science in practice than genomics that won't change the way we eat. But having a more research on good eat, but in the structure of recognition, it's not recognized. The Journal of Health Research has maybe an impact factor of 1.2, not 25.5. So we can predict things and see if they're right or wrong. So it's really a good social science model to understand the practical dynamics, not the morality of it, but how it will behave in all probability.
This was already fascinating, really. I mean, I'm deeply impressed by this talk. And you have a great diagnosis of the fine structure or the hidden structure, actually, of the reproducibility crisis. I'm wondering whether you've got any hints about how it can be addressed as a problem. What should be done to fix it? I've got in mind the MMR vaccine crisis issue. The vaccine, the MMR, which caused lots of grief.
Yeah.
It took 20 years for Lancet to retract this article, although 12 authors, I think, out of the 13 had renounced the article before that. And it's got irreversible effects, actually, on the mentality of parents when it comes to vaccination of the children. So should we slow down and should we change the way we referee, we reproduce, we look at the funding of the sources of the papers? Any ideas? I mean, it's a crucial political issue as well as social and scientific.
Yes, I totally agree. And in fact, now I transform myself into a social actor that says, I want to change the thing. And I think that we can show that if we accept the slow science principles, most of the problems that will disappear. I will give you one concrete example that happened recently that maybe Alan is also aware. Last year or 2 years ago, there was a big splash in Nature or Science, because I read both, so I never remember which one, where a group of physicists at Harvard University announced the creation of solid-state hydrogen. Okay? It's very hard to have solid-state hydrogen. It takes an infinite pressure. It's very hard. But a group of physicists in Paris says, but that's crazy. They have not proven solid-state hydrogen. Because to prove it, they don't have only to measure the transparent. The way they do it, that they put a small amount of hydrogen into a big system, they put the pressure very fast, and they have a laser that comes through. If it becomes a solid, then the transparency will change. So we can measure that. But they say that's one measure. But they said the real proof is that it has to be superconducting. So I have to measure the electricity of it. But they have not done it. So the Harvard group says, well, you're right, we will do it in the future. So what they did is, okay, we have the hint of a discovery of solid-state hydrogen. It takes time to do the other two experiments. But if we don't go fast, the French or the Russian, whatever, will find it before. So what we'll do, we're Harvard after all, we'll publish this result in Nature and Science, which accepted it, they should not, saying, okay, go to the bag, go back to the lab, measure the electricity, measure the superconductivity, put that together and publish it. So there was a big debate between those two groups because you know what happened? If tomorrow they measure the French group of them, the French group shows that it's supraconductor. It's very difficult to measure all those together. People want to remember that. They will not publish that in Nature. The discovery has been published. So they were debating it. So slow science will diminish retractation. That's quite obvious. will diminish a corrigendum. That's quite obvious because you would have tried it, tested it before, and also it would make better science. But the problem is that we have to convince professor to do that because it's professor who are hiring the students now. It's those on the committee, the VP research, that ask you, hey, Yves, you don't have a paper this year. Give me a break. I'm working on a big paper. It will take 2 years. Okay, so it seems that this movement is beginning. There's even a book came out by two women professor at University of Toronto, which was a big success. It's called The Slow Professor. Of course, it's in the same vein. It's a slow professor. I have a big research project. Don't ask me every year because of the renewal of grant and the debates at the National Science Foundation of limiting the number of grants that every scientist can have is linked to that also. You want 5 grants because you have a big story. So it's a restructuration of all of this. Of course, it will not happen tomorrow. But it's not that complicated. It means that when you evaluate your colleagues, you say, come on, you published last year, or come on, we want again evaluate you every year. Come back in 5 years, and if in 5 years you have done nothing, maybe we'll ask questions. So coming back to some academic common sense would be a part of the solution, including the predatory journals. They will disappear. They will disappear, that's for sure, if we apply this. So that's my token contribution to changing the system.
Richard and then Stu.
Well, as someone who has spent a large part of my career trying to do slow science, I certainly appreciate that, but whether it can actually be implemented as practice is another matter entirely. You had many interesting and important things in your talk that I wanted to comment on. I'll just mention 2. One of which is this sort of challenge to science that's happened over the years with the proliferation of journals, so there's more journals than scientists, the proliferation of publications, and nobody can keep up or read anything anymore because there's too much, and all the other challenges we're hearing about in the reproducibility domain and all the other challenges in science in terms of resources and money and everything else you can think of. How is it that science is progressing so rapidly anyway? And that's an interesting question, and it's related to what you're talking about. The answer I give is that it's in the social network of scientists at meetings like this and at other places where the better scientists get together and exchange ideas and surmount all these difficulties. So it's my best answer for how we're making progress anyway.
Yeah. I think the question of progress is what do we mean by making progress? Because I just finished a small book about history of science where I realized that if we look at the big discoveries over the last 20 years, the whole part, the same paradigm, the big Higgs boson is the standard model of the 1960s. Okay, everything, even CRISPR-Cas9, which is a technology, it's DNA. The only thing that could happen in the near future, which would be a revolution, is the dark matter, which we don't see anyhow, nowhere, and looks a lot like ether in the 19th century. Same structure. Maybe we'll discover it. But so we have nominally progress in the technological applications. But in scientific knowledge, in biology, and new knowledge, the only one which was important 10 years ago is epigenetics. That's an opening of genetics. It's not against genetics. Epigenetics is a good thing, but it's still part of the dominant paradigm. So we progress, not a lot, I think. It's not like we did in the 1900s,
We can
1920s.
argue about that. I think progress is, every talk I hear of biology amazes me, and I hear talks on a million different subjects.
Yeah.
And they're all
So it's a subjective definition.
But the other interesting thing you mentioned was computer science. So there's been a movement. Victoria Stott is the one who's been pushing very hard for open science in computers, where you publish your code, so it's available.
Yeah.
And and then you can verify that the claims that are made in the papers, you can run the code and see if it, hopefully, and see if it does produce what's claimed. But that's only one tiny part of the problem, because there's 2 even bigger problems. One is many of these computer programs are very complicated. And knowing whether the computer program is doing what you say it's doing, what is it actually doing is a much harder problem.
Yeah.
And nobody quite knows how to answer that question, because when you have a complicated program, it's about as complicated to figure out what it's doing as just to figure out what the human mind is doing. And that is even if you have the code, as you pointed out, you need the data, how much the code is run, and it makes a difference with what the data is. And much of the data is proprietary, you have to buy it. You can't get it sometimes, so we use Google Images and things like that to get a hold of much of the data that we need, that you want to run the code on, is not even available. So there's two big challenges in the computation to it.
Because it's more linked to technology. Look at the debate over CRISPR-Cas9. The patent office decided to give the patent to Berkeley, and in Europe they said no. So because CRISPR-Cas9 intellectually it's a great thing, but commercially it's a big fight between two groups that want to have billions of dollars instead of having it in the, because we could ask, is that an invention? Of course it's not an invention, it's what's going on in microbes. They have invented nothing, they have discovered the way microbes do the corrections.
Just wanted to point out that there's I don't even know where it would fit in this diagram, but I think there's a third way that actually used to be in effect between sort of slow science and multiplication of papers, and that was when, at least I can remember, that Nature and Science were not the journals of record.
Yep.
They were the newspapers of science. And so a paper that would come out in Nature or Science, you would expect that 6 or 8 months later, some rather large paper would come
Yep.
out in the Journal of Physiology or something like that,
Yep.
that would really expand this short notification in Nature. Not that publishing in Nature and Science wasn't a certain kind of pissing in the corners
Yeah.
and so forth and so on, but nonetheless, they have somehow or other morphed into the Journal of Record.
Yeah.
And that's where I see the problem coming, in that once you publish in Nature, the subject seems to be over. Try and get a graduate student to work on a subject that's already had a Nature paper. Forget
Yeah.
it, they're not interested.
Yeah, I think it's linked to this small thing, and here's the mechanism. If you say, okay, I look at your paper, now if I say I count, I cannot count the citations because it takes 5 years. I have to evaluate you now. So what is the equivalent of the citation that will come in 5 years? Is the impact factor, which is the expected average number of citations in the journal, which is Lotka distribution, which means that 20% of the journal of the paper in Nature, 20% of the papers explain 80% of the citation. But they say, okay, the impact factor is 25. Here's a number. It's the lamppost effect. Oh, I have this number. So I evaluate you, accounting unit, publish in a 25 impact factor journal, not in a 2.4, even though physical review, for example, I think it's a political act in part that the discovery of gravitational waves was in Physical Review Letters, which is the journal for physicists, not Nature. Nature Science would have liked to get this paper, believe it, because it's a secular thing, okay? But if you stay there, that's what happened with the DNA and the neutron. They were half a page and they say, okay, we'll develop that in the Journal of Biology, 20 pages about the DNA, 20 pages about the neutron in Philosophical Magazine. So you're right, it's transformed, but my theory is that it's linked to this. If it's there, there would be, as it was before, a very good journal, there's no doubt about this, but a journal of announcing the biggest thing that will be explained in the journal. And now it's so true that you should know that in China, they give money, so the impact factor is what I call now a monetary unit. If you have, and in all management schools, they have a list, impact factor of 5 equals $5,000. It's all existent now. So it's this problem. So you want to be into impact factor 25, because then you get $10,000 instead of $5,000.
So I let, and then.
So thank you. And you said at the beginning that trust is very important for your and so I really like that. I think it's very important. But so I suggest that maybe show how trust fits in your schema. And trust is not something so simple. I'm taking it's not my idea. What Catherine Howley, the way she describes trust, maybe it could be relevant to you. Because she says, okay, so when the opposite of trust is not distrust, and you use both terms in your talk. Sometimes, and I think the distinction she makes could be relevant to our issue. Because she says, look, trust is about me believing that you have the ability to do something and that you intend to do it. Now, if I have no trust in you, it means I don't think you can actually do it. And this goes to this intermediate level with the predatory journals and the people that they cannot reproduce it. And I think the level of publicity it gets is very low, like you said. And you mix that together with a completely different kind of distrust, saying that, well, maybe you can reproduce it, you have no intention to.
Yep.
And these are the types of issues that get a lot of publicity. And making this distinction in what do you mean by the crisis of trust might order a bit differently this, and might focus the schema to what causes big change and what happens all the time and people don't notice too much.
The reason that trust is not in the system is because trust is the foundation of the system. It's not in that. Even this, for example, we could decide that it's good that it's an accounting unit. I don't care. But even this will be scrapped because trust is behind that. And there are two kinds of trust. I think we don't need in concept. Trust has this aspect about your capacity of doing things, but trust has a lot to do with the results. Also, it's still, if I say, I went there and I counted them, there were 50 in the class, it's not that I trust you know how to count. It's not only that, it's that I know you know how to count, but I don't trust you because you have an interest to see that there were 50 person in the class instead of 20. So I don't trust the results. So the notion of trust is really, as it says, trust. And it's the basic social concept. So this is why it cannot be there. It's behind. What I say is that because of this mechanism, this will create a starting to erode the trust in the system. Okay? Because in the past you only had this, because here you had the physical review, suppose you have just physical review. It's a trusted journal, it's believed in, they publish a certain amount of paper, but they want triple the number. So we have trust in physical review letters. But here we are eroding trust. So trust is always behind in the system, and this mechanism is eroding it. And why it's eroding? Because it's a cascading effect. Of course, there's no intention of the VP research who wants you a paper in Nature to erode trust. It doesn't want that. But because of that, it pushes you, and it pushes a lot of people to, for example, the Harvard paper on the solid state hydrogen, maybe they did not observe it because they have not the three measures at the same time. But they wanted to publish rapidly. So they erode trust into, okay, the French don't trust the Harvard group. That's what it means. So I think that in sociology in general, trust has this basic sense, and it cannot be in the system, it's behind. But the system can erode the trust, which is the foundations of everything. You trusted me that when you pet the airplanes, I would come here today. That's the basic notion of trust.
Yeah, I have a question. I don't know whether I fully understand, say, the role of Robert Merton's scientific ethos in your presentation. Maybe I misunderstand it, but there seems to be an ambiguity. So on the one hand, you say, yeah, on the basis of Merton's system of science, now people ask for, say, more applications, and that is misguided because in the current system that will not help. So you say in a way, at least if I understand you correctly, that that system of Merton is that's not applicable to current science, basically. But then on the other hand, in your pleas for open science, I think you implicitly use notions that Merton would agree to, like the organized skepticism, meaning, say, the relaxed discussion of all kinds of claims and so on. So I was a bit unclear how what the exact status is of this account.
I will clarify because first, I never said that the normative structure of Merton does not apply today. No, that's not what I said. Because essentially, first, in the scientific field, again, I'm not talking about in the scientific field, so organized skepticism works, disinterest is not important, and all of this works. There is still the universalism of results. This is why someone in prison can publish scientific papers in journals. They don't say, oh, he should not publish because he's in prison. No, he's in prison and he published mathematical engineering. I know a guy like that. And so this works. What I'm saying is that, for example, in 56, what Merton explained is that, okay, if you want to understand the danger now is that if you push, if you push originality too much, it will create a tension because people want priority dispute recognition and it will behave with bad system. He made a good prediction about the rise of this problem. Now, the dysfunction of today, it's not that they are wrong to say, people are not wrong to say, I'm just saying that if you want to change the system, in all probability, it will be very difficult because we've been trying to do slow science for decades and it doesn't work because those are in power says, no, you need your paper in Nature or you won't be renewed. So it's still working, but in a different way because here it was working as a unit of knowledge. This originality is now not measured as a unit of knowledge, it's measured as an accounting unit. Okay, so I see no contradiction, maybe I was not clear in my statement, but this is, for me, still working very well. The proof is that we still name new discoveries after the name of the discoverer, but what is different behind this is the evaluation, which explain predatory journal. So it means that I talk about two different levels. The social norms implicit in the scientific community, which still works. The proof is that tomorrow, if someone make a fraud, he will lose his job. He won't go in jail because it's symbolic capital. He will just lose his job. So I see no contradiction in those explanations.
Well, yeah. Now I'm shifted from not understanding to disagreeing with this. I think this originality and so this part of the work of Merton can be somewhat seen separate from his ethos, and so I think actually I disagree that Merton had a strong claim that his ethos was strongly institutionalized.
Yeah.
And I think you cannot really at the moment say that that's true. So because look at organized skepticism, I mean, like commercialization of science has produced a lot of say. Biased research line in a certain direction and about all these norms you can be very critical.
Yeah.
So I think you can still use Merton's system, but then you have to play down, say, the actual institutionalization in the social system and emphasize much more the normative aspect of it, saying that it is something we should maybe try to reinstate. And this is how I read your plea for slow science. Sorry.
Yeah, I think the ambiguity is linked to the fact that here it's an abstract system. If you talk about the fact that there are commercial interests that diminish organized skepticism, we totally agree. It's just an empirical fact. But it's only in subfield. It's not in the fields of elementary particle physics. It's not in the field of solid-state physics. It's in the field of biomedical research. So I agree that in different fields, these things will apply differently. But this is an axiomatic structure of Merton 1956 paper, where he adds to the 39 paper includes only those 4 norms. Okay, the 51 or 56 is talk at the American Sociological Association adds his 68 paper on ambivalence of the scientist, adds originality and humility, as he said, sub-norms. He is not used about the world, but this is the way he constructed. That's quite obvious in the axiomatic structure. Now, is it applicable today? We can think it should be better applied. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's like the family, you know. In the family, you have implicit norms. Some break them, some don't break them to larger extent, and they go in jail if they break them too much. So I don't think it's a disagreement. It's a way to reformulate it, which is different. You insist on the fact that now it's less perfect than it was. which may be true, but I want, saying that it's less institutionalized, as a sociologist, I will say, I want a measure of that. I'm not saying it's not the case. I'm saying that there's a moral venue that science is less pure than it was. As a sociologist, I say that's a discourse. I want measure of that. So I give measure of the rise of the dysfunction, the rise of fraud, the rise of retractation. There are other measures, but I don't think that in the scientific field in universities, this is less institutionalized. So we disagree on this.
Yeah, Richard?
Are we about to go to break?
We have 10 minutes.
Well, I was just going to say that one of your comments made me think of Stigler's Law. Stigler's Law was that no
Yeah.
law that's named after
Yeah.
its discoverer was ever actually discovered by that person,
Yeah,
including Stigler's Law.
exactly. I know that, yeah. Who was a friend of Merton, who is this, and his son is Merton of Merton Scholl, the economist.
Just wondering with your schema, I'm a grad student, so I'm very sympathetic to the idea that I'm not going to have a job when I get done all this.
Yeah, good.
And I think that plays into your schema. I think I'd like to know how you account for the fact that there are a growing number of scholars who are going to schools maybe that are less reputable, whatever that looks like. Now you have this plethora of PhDs, dissertations, articles, and it just contributes to that information glut.
Yeah.
And I think it plays a role in trust, in all, everything that you're talking about.
Yes, this is linked to something that I cannot develop in detail, but I did a paper on this. In the actual system in the 20th century, we have always confused what I call the scientific field. The scientific field is the abstract space where papers surrounds, people debates about Einstein. It's an abstract space. They don't ask if Einstein was at the patent office. They don't care. And you have the university field, which is in fact the place where most of the research is done. So the university field is the institutional foundations of what is going on. Of course, there are stuff in industry, but it's a 10% of the paper, it's not 50%. The majority is going on in universities. But the dynamics, the logic of the university is not the logic of the scientific field. It's to have more and more students, because it depends on the country, but in my country, you get the grant from the government by the amount of students. So a student at the PhD is equal 3 times a student at the BA. So if I have to run in the street and grab students, I better grab a PhD student than a BA student, because it's for the same work I get three times the same. So there's overproduction in Canada, and I wrote this in University Affairs, we have the stats. There are overproduction of students and PhD and of postdoc. Because if you cut the postdoc in the biomedical lab of universities, the productivity going down by at least 2/3. Because we have looked at the name, my student, Vincent Larivière, did his PhD called On the Shoulder of Students, where he shows that the signed paper in biomedical research in many are not only the professor, but most of them, either the PhD student doing the work that I told them, quotation, or the postdoc who does it. So it's the dysfunction of the university system, the university field, that explain the overproduction and the fact that people are misled to think that they will live in the scientific field. They will not live in the scientific field. And even Bruce Albert, who is not nobody, who was the head of the National Academy of Sciences, said 10 years ago, because the NSF and the American system is the incarnation of this absurd system. He says the American system is going into the wall. And this is why they want to cut the number, because to be the first PI at the NSF now you have 41 years. It means that you're not 32 years, you're 41 or 45, I forget, it's going up. So it means that the new researcher is already 40. That's something bizarre. So the system is broken, and it has to be restructured, but it will be costly and it will be drastic if they do it. So they won't do it, they will go in the wall.
You want to comment? I'm sorry.
Yeah, you can have a follow-up and then final question, Marie.
Your follow-up.
All right, I just want to say that I completely disagree with that interpretation.
Good.
That I think anytime you say we have too many PhDs, you're just saying we should have a stupider society. The problem is not too many PhDs, the problem is not sufficient funding for them. And it's often used by people like Bruce Alberts and others who write in PNAS,
Yeah.
that this was due to the doubling of the NIH budget
Yeah.
under first Bush and then Clinton.
Yeah.
And now this unrealistic idea that
Okay.
we can continue to
Okay.
grow biomedical research.
Yeah.
But both Bush and Clinton purposely doubled the NIH budget to expand it rapidly. They wanted universities to build new science buildings, to open new positions, because there was a huge opportunity for biomedical research to expand, which there still is. What's happened is the promise has not been kept. The government has decided to let the funding go flat, and now suddenly, yes, we seem to have too many PhDs for the jobs. The problem is not too many PhDs, it's too few jobs.
Yes,
And as long as we admit the other, we're just playing their game.
Yeah. No, I'm not playing any game. I try to understand the dynamic of a system. So here is my answer. Is that this argument, which I know very well, because in Quebec, the chief scientists and all those people tell me the same. And they tell me, no, and it's in University Affairs, I wrote that there. They say, no, there's no overproduction. It's the system that is not accommodating them, because even companies don't want to have a PhD. They want a master, because for the job he will be doing, you don't want to pay him at the level of PhD. So some people will hide their PhD, say, I have a good master degree. Yes, you're good, $45,000. You have a PhD, $60,000, forget it. Okay, so what is their argument? It's very simple. They say, it's not overproduction, it's the capacity of absorption. I say, okay, that's true. Companies in Canada, at least, don't hire PhD because it costs too much. So I say, here's the absurdity of this example. Very simple analogy. You pour water on a terrain. It absorbs. It has a capacity of absorption. At some point, it drowns. The water goes up. Then you say, well, you should stop pouring water. No, it's not the water. It's the film that does not absorb. I said, well, during the time it does not absorb, will you continue? No, you will have to stop and try to understand how to make the soil more absorbent. Maybe by adding some stuff that it will absorb more. Though just saying as simple that, no, it's just the government. In society, there's not just scientists. Huh? There are a lot of companies, there are people. We tend to look at ourselves as the whole of society. The government should produce everyone as a PhD. I said, why do you think since 20 years we talk about overqualification? Not me, the actors in the field. They say, oh, there is overqualification. Why? Because those people that we get out from the university with a PhD gets in jobs that are enough for a master's degree, and they are paid like a master's degree, and their resentment, the rise of resentment is related to the reality, and except if you decide that it's only the government that will pay for all the PhD. What I'm explaining is that if you want to understand why there has been a creation recently of the Association of Postdoc, sociologically speaking, when a group starts to organize, it means that there are problems. And that's what they did. So that's what I mean by of course, you imagine that I train PhD, I'm not against training them. But I say, let's try to take a distance, observe the dynamics of the behavior of people, their reaction, the rise in the number of postdoc. Why is there a rise of the number of postdoc? If there are jobs, they won't be postdoc. They will be professor or PhD with Bayer, with Monsanto. That's not what is going on. So there is an overproduction.
Final question.
I was going to make a very similar point and sympathetic to the same objection, but because the way you put it, it sounded like there's overproduction of people who are going to be researchers. That's how it came across. Ontario, 5-7 years ago, decided we want 10 times as many MAs as previously.
Yes.
And now roughly 50% of Ontario has a university education, and they want the norm to be an MA.
Yeah.
And the thinking is that the most productive, happiest, most successful society in the world will be the one that's the best educated, and Ontario aims to be that society. And I don't see anything that you said that would undercut that policy. If you said there's just too many people in biomedical science or too many high energy physicists, I can understand that argument. But I think you said to refuse to have more is just to make your society more stupid. I think those were your words. And I'm completely on side with that.
Of course, but everyone agree that more knowledge is better than less. So that's not what I'm doing. But take your students in Ontario. If you look at the price of their going to, I'm not against, I'm analyzing the data. If you look at the data and you look at the price they go to university, they pay say $12,000 or $25,000 a year, they go for 5 years, And when they got a job after that, what is the salary they get? As we know, and look at Statistics Canada data, companies, and they are wrong, but that's the reality, don't want people. And you mentioned master degree, that's just what I said. There have been studies showing that the optimal diploma in the reality of today, not in the wonderful world that we all dream of, is master degree. So those PhDs, look at them, of course they get a job, and they have 3% of unemployment instead of 8 or 10 if you are high school. We all agree on this. But agreeing on this is not negating the fact that there is and why do they continue to produce PhD that they say they will do research? They won't do research. Because research, as you said, is at the NRC, CNRS, or NIH, and not at university that are not replacing. But just to tell you that it's based on ideology, in 2004, an economist, supposedly to know economy, predicted with all the Quebec universities that there would be a massive lack of teachers in 2010. I said at the time, you're just out of your mind, because they don't look at the data. They say people will retire, which is true, but they said, you suppose they will be replaced. But look at the demographic of university hiring. It's stable. So why do you think now we all are for internationalization, bringing 10,000 Chinese students at U of T? Because the demographic of the local place does not answer the system. And the thing is wrong. I said, don't be naive about internationalization is good. We didn't say that in 75, neither in 82. We say that now because we don't hire professors because it's going down, and we search new students from all the countries that pay $50,000. So we have to look at the whole thing. That's what I mean. I'm not against training people, but there is overproduction in any meaning of StatsCan data. I stick to that.
Well, let's thank you for a great. Next, we're going to have a poster session.